Hi everyone, my name is Katy Gero, and I'm going to be talking about our work called What Makes Tweetorials Tick, in which we dig into how experts are communicating complex topics on Twitter. This is work that I did with my colleagues at Columbia University and Barnard College. So I'm going to give the first part of this talk, and then Vivian is going to wrap it up for us. So this work is really about how science communication is working on Twitter. In particular, we're talking about this thing called Tweetorials. So on the left here, we have a tweetorial by Jennifer Harrison about dung beetle navigation. And so she starts this by saying, so today I was talking about evolution being amazing and literally every animal being awesome, and I'm told the dung beetle isn't. And then she says thread to kind of indicate that the next tweets are going to be threaded and also about this. She goes on to share some very interesting facts and history about dung beetle navigation at night. I really recommend it. Truly, dung beetles are amazing. So we wanted to study this because Twitter has actually become a really popular venue for science communication. There's no barrier to entry, and a lot of scientists are garnering a really wide and diverse following. So not just other scientists, but journalists, policymakers, lay people. We saw this especially during COVID. It's really become a really important part of the science communication ecosystem. So to study this, we wanted to collect a set of tweetorials. This was our definition for tweetorials, at least 5 threaded tweets with the goal of teaching the reader a main concept. Now, it's pretty difficult to find tweetorials in the wild. There is a tweetorial hashtag, but it's not used very consistently, and it's not used by all of the different disciplines. So instead, what we did is we had a 2-step process. During our initial collection, we started with a set of seed tweetorials that members of the team, which includes a science journalist, had seen in their own social media feeds. And then we used a Twitter account where we would always be following new people who might be posting tweetorials. And we also used a number of Twitter thread aggregators to search. So we did daily searches across a number of different platforms, and we did this for about a month, and we collected over 200 potential tweetorials. So we collected anything that looked like it might be right. Then in the second step, we did a curation. So at least 2 researchers reviewed each tweetorial to make sure that they met our definition and that they were clear and engaging. This resulted in 46 tweetorials for us to study. And we want to note that obviously the curation step is somewhat subjective. So we don't want to make any claims that this is representative of all tweetorials across Twitter, but rather we just think it's a nice starting point to start to look into how is this working. So to give you a quick overview of our collection, they tended to be about 15 tweets in length. And around 600 words. So we're looking at, a short essay length. People are really getting into it and explaining something in detail. And we found them from a variety of disciplines. So again, this isn't meant to be representative of all tweetorials, but we wanted to make sure that we had tweetorials from biology, climate science, as well as the humanities, medicine, mathematics, politics, etc. So what I want to spend most of my time talking about are some unique tweetorial writing techniques. Tweetorials used a lot of common writing techniques that we see in most science communication, like narratives, analogies, intriguing questions to hook the reader at the beginning. But I want to talk about the things that seemed kind of special to tweetorials or to Twitter in general. The first is what we call the time peg. So this is an example from a computer science professor who is saying, my university just announced that it's dumping Blackboard, and there was much rejoicing. And then he goes on, so Blackboard is a piece of software that his university uses for student management stuff and class management. And then he goes on to explain some very interesting things about how enterprise software is designed. But he doesn't just jump in, right? He doesn't just say, I'm going to talk about enterprise software. Instead, he pegs it to this moment in time. He says, why am I talking about this now? Well, this thing just happened, and it seemed like an important moment to explain this concept. Relatedly, there's something called correct the record. So this is an example from a journalist who says, all this talk about opposition research tonight is driving me nuts because so many people are getting it wrong. And then he goes on to explain what opposition research really is and how it works. And so here he's correcting some conversation that's already going on Twitter. He says, all these people are talking about this thing, and I'm going to come in as an expert and give you some kind of expert information about this topic that is maybe going viral or is just very popular in his sphere. Now, what you might expect on Twitter is a lot of informal tone, but actually what we saw is this interesting mix of informal and formal register. So this is from a tweetorial about the history of research on MSG. And so she says, this is kind of from the middle. The whole panic around MSG started when a doctor wrote to the New England Journal of Medicine in 1968. So this is a pretty formal sentence. You might see something like this in the New York Times or in a newspaper, but then she moves into all caps and says, oh man, my head hurts and my limbs tingle, right? So she's kind of seamlessly going into this informal register. And then later on, she'll actually go back to the formal register. And we saw this a lot, this kind of very smooth intermixing. Media usage, as one might expect, really interesting on Twitter. One really interesting example is what we call visual citations. So sometimes people would take a screenshot of a newspaper and actually use that as like a primary source, depending on what they were talking about. Or they might take a screenshot of an academic paper and use that as a kind of citation inline, where people could actually see the whole title, authors, etc. The last thing I want to talk about is how people would build credibility during the tweetorial. So because anyone can post a tweetorial on Twitter, it also means you don't always know much about the person, the author of what you're reading. And so we saw this a lot where people would do something like this physicist did, where he's talking about some experiments from NASA and theories of parallel universes. And he's saying, astrophysics is a potential explanation for this phenomena that he's discussing. And he suggests that you look at a recent paper by himself and others, and he links to the paper, right? So here he's kind of subtly embedding this thing where he's like, I'm an expert, I do research in this field. These are reasons why you should trust me. So that wraps up a very quick tour of some interesting things we found about tweetorials. And now Vivian is going to talk about how we see tweetorials fitting into some larger changes about how science communication is changing overall.
So now, after examining tweetorials at length, we're going to talk about tweetorials in the broader context of science communication. So tweetorials exemplify post-normal science communication, which is a mode of science communication that has emerged in response to the following societal shifts. The first is the introduction of digital networks. The second is the increased ideological polarization of our society. And the third is the increased interpretation of scientific results in the context of risk, political value, as well as policy. So previously, normal science communication was predicated on this idea that there would be a linear handoff from the scientists to the media to the public. But now, post-normal science communication is really renegotiating those norms, such that they now include things like transparency, advocacy, contextual interpretation of science, as well as participation from the public. So the tutorials that we analyzed tended to exhibit advocacy as well as participation. And we found that experts could relay their scientific results to the public using narratives, relatability, as well as subjectivity. So these rhetorical strategies that we discussed earlier help scientists on Twitter present themselves more authentically, help them frame their findings more engagingly, and also more accessibly. And it also helps them establish context and credibility far faster. When scientists are engaging with their audiences on Twitter, they're introducing science through the voice of an individual rather than the voice of an institution, which is how it's usually done. Usually you present science through conferences, universities, or journals. But this foregrounding of the scientist as an individual may be both beneficial as well as harmful for science communication as a whole. We also note that writers are constrained by the formats of the platform. They are forced to convey science in pithy 280 character limited tweets, in tweet threads, and writers are similarly influenced by the biases and social dynamics of the platforms, as well as the way they encourage writers to chase after engagement metrics. Nonetheless, we believe that tutorials are here to stay, just as social media is. And for that reason, we believe that it is imperative to study how we can support communities of practice around this and how we can build tools for writing support. So in our paper, we also have some more details on the former, so please turn to look at that. And we hope that you have learned a little bit about how tutorials are an emerging form of science communication and post-normal science communication in particular.